Mrs. Hurtle said on the afternoon of her last day. "Indeed, then, I don't like it at all. They're the ugliest children you ever see, Mrs. Hurtle." "Ugly children must be minded as well as pretty ones." "And the mother of 'em is as cross as cross." "It's your own fault, Ruby, isn't it?" "I don't know as I've done anything out of the way." "Don't you think it's anything out of the way to be engaged to a young man, and then to throw him over? All this has come because you wouldn't keep your word to Mr. Crumb. Only for that your grandfather wouldn't have turned you out of his house." "He didn't turn me out. I ran away, and it wasn't along of John Crumb, but because grandfather hauled me about by the hair of my head." "But he was angry with you about Mr. Crumb. When a young woman becomes engaged to a young man, she ought not to go back from her word." No doubt Mrs. Hurtle, when preaching this doctrine, thought that the same law might be laid down with propriety for the conduct of young men. "Of course you have brought trouble on yourself. I am sorry you don't like the place. I'm afraid you must go to it now." "I am a-going, I suppose," said Ruby, probably feeling that if she could but bring herself to condescend so far, there might yet be open for her a way of escape. "I shall write and tell Mr. Crumb where you are placed." "Oh, Mrs. Hurtle, don't! What should you write to him for? It ain't nothing to him." "I told him I'd let him know if any steps were taken." "You can forget that, Mrs. Hurtle. Pray don't write. I don't want him to know as I'm in service." "I must keep my promise. Why shouldn't he know? I don't suppose you care much now what he hears about you." "Yes, I do. I wasn't never in service before, and I don't want him to know." "What harm can it do you?" "Well, I don't want him to know. It's such a come down, Mrs. Hurtle." "There is nothing to be ashamed of in that. What you have to be ashamed of is jilting him. It was a bad thing to do, wasn't it, Ruby?" "I didn't mean nothing bad, Mrs. Hurtle. Only why couldn't he say what he had to say himself, instead of bringing another to say it for him? What would you feel, Mrs. Hurtle, if a man was to come and say it all out of another man's mouth?" "I don't think I should much care if the thing was well said at last. You know he meant it." "Yes, I did know that." "And you know he means it now?" "I'm not so sure about that. He's gone back to Bungay, and he isn't no good at writing letters no more than at speaking. Oh, he'll go and get somebody else now." "Of course he will if he hears nothing about you. I think I'd better tell him. I know what would happen." "What would happen, Mrs. Hurtle?" "He'd be up in town again in half a jiffy to see what sort of a place you'd got. Now, Ruby, I'll tell you what I'll do if you'll say the word. I'll have him up here at once, and you shan't go to Mrs. Buggins'." Ruby dropped her hands and stood still, staring at Mrs. Hurtle. "I will. But if he comes you mustn't behave this time as you did before." "But I'm to go to Mrs. Buggins' to morrow." "We'll send to Mrs. Buggins and tell her to get somebody else. You're breaking your heart about going there, are you not?" "I don't like it, Mrs. Hurtle." "And this man will make you mistress of his house. You say he isn't good at speaking, but I tell you I never came across an honester man in the whole course of my life, or one who I think would treat a woman better. What's the use of a glib tongue if there isn't a heart with it? What's the use of a lot of tinsel and lacquer if the real metal isn't there? Sir Felix Carbury could talk, I dare say, but you don't think now he was a very fine fellow." "He was so beautiful, Mrs. Hurtle." "But he hadn't the spirit of a mouse in his bosom. Well, Ruby, you have one more choice left you. Shall it be John Crumb or Mrs. Buggins?" "He wouldn't come, Mrs. Hurtle." "Leave that to me, Ruby. May I bring him if I can?" Then Ruby in a very low whisper told Mrs. Hurtle that if she thought proper she might bring John Crumb back again. "And there shall be no more nonsense?" "No," whispered Ruby. On that same night a letter was sent to Mrs. Buggins, which Mrs. Hurtle also composed, informing that lady that unforeseen circumstances prevented Ruby Ruggles from keeping the engagement she had made. To which a verbal answer was returned that Ruby Ruggles was an impudent hussy. And then Mrs. Hurtle in her own name wrote a short note to Mr. John Crumb. "Dear Mr. Crumb, if you will come back to London I think you will find Miss Ruby Ruggles all that you desire. Yours faithfully, Winifred Hurtle." "She's had a deal more done for her than I ever knew to be done for young women in my time," said Mrs. Pipkin, "and I'm not at all so sure that she has deserved it." "John Crumb will think she has." "John Crumb's a fool. And as to Ruby, well, I haven't got no patience with girls like them. Yes, it is for the best. And as for you, Mrs. Hurtle, there's no words to say how good you've been. I hope, Mrs. Hurtle, you ain't thinking of going away because this is all done." CHAPTR 80